And my objective, I guess, is to give a broad picture overview before the experts tell us what they think is important in terms of development financing. So I wanted to just make sure we had some of the basic facts about what is development financing, what's the scale, what are the issues, but also I couldn't resist putting in some of my own conclusions. So the first slide gives you my structure, and I'm going to show you some of the figures, but these are the main facts, I think. So outflows of finance from developing countries exceed inflows, and this has been true for a number of years. The second point is a large part of this is about unregulated capital flows, which have huge costs for developing countries. The third point is that, of course, inflows and outflows are very small compared to domestic resources, both public and private. So getting those to work well is obviously a critically important factor. And then fourth, I just wanted to draw a few initial conclusions, which maybe will be disputed or picked up or ignored by the rest of the panel. So the first point on outflows. Next slide, please. So this is many thanks to development initiatives who are here at the back, who did an excellent report on different financial flows from which I'm drawing these figures. And they show the major different resources that flow in and out of developing countries. And what I've done in the blue boxes on the left is the totally reported inflows. And there's an issue about how accurate those figures are, which we can come to. And then in the next column are outflows that are associated with those inflows, which allows us therefore to have some net figures. Now these figures are global and therefore obviously not perfect, but they at least give us an indication of scale. So first of all, we have remittances, inflows, very large. Outflows of remittances from developing countries to other countries, relatively small, gives us a net of 304 billion in 2011. Loans, both private and government loans. Significant inflow, 710 billion, but obviously large outflows in terms of interest and capital repayments. This is a net of around 200 billion. ODA, or aid, significant inflows, over 160 billion, but also outflows, which is mostly interest repayments on concessional and other loans made as aid. Then we have the big private flow, foreign direct investment, which everybody talks a lot about, the scale of it. I could talk to you quite a lot about the problems with the figure, which would cause all kinds of things, including the reinvestment of earnings earned within developing countries. So there's a big crossover there for the domestic investment. But here what we see is that there's large inflows to developing countries, and you'll know that recently they overtook developed countries as the main destination for FDI. But there's also huge outflows, so 420 billion, or about 90% of the value of inflows associated with the repatriation of profits earned from that FDI. So money going in, but also a lot of money coming out at the same time. We have NGOs, foundations, relatively small. Portfolio equity, which is buying stocks and shares in developing countries. Don't have figures, inflows, outflows. This is not very well recorded. Looks quite small in 2011, but what it hides is there's huge volatility in that figure. Sometimes it goes up enormously, sometimes it goes negative enormously, as it did during the financial crisis. And this flow is, if you like, the hot money flow, the one that often causes significant problems to developing countries as investors lose confidence and withdraw their most liquid form of capital. They sell their stocks and shares. So you have that, and then you have other official flows, which are government-to-government transfers, and there's also outflows associated with that in terms of when those are given as loans, repayments, and other things. So here you have a picture of the main different types of flows, and you can see that the order in which they come in net terms is not the same as the order in which they come if you just look at the total figures. So I think it's quite important to understand that, okay, FDI might be large, but then there's a big outflow associated with that as well. Loans obviously have to be repaid. So what this comes to is a total 771 billion. Again, take the exact number with a pinch of salt, but a little less than 800 billion in 2011 of net inflows to developing countries. So the next slide shows you how this compares with the two major outflows. So there's net inflows on the left, but what we can see, and we work a lot on Eurodad and in the network on illicit financial flows, which are mainly motivated by companies' tax evasion. And these figures from Global Financial Integrity put that at close to $1 trillion in 2011, already bigger than all of those inflows net together. So developing countries losing more because of problems of the global tax and financial system, centered around the problem of tax havens, than they get if you add all the other flows together. So that's a very important point to remember. Second very important point to remember is this reserve accumulation, which was worth 827 billion in 2011. That is developing countries, mostly emerging markets, but also other developing countries, increasing their reserves because they are worried about the effects of financial and other crises. So they're suffering from a lot of insecurity in the current climate. They don't trust the IMF to be the lender of last resort. They're insuring themselves against crisis and instability. How are they doing that? Increasing their reserves. What does that mean in practice? They're buying safe assets, mostly US treasuries. So I think about 2/3 of that figure is basically developing countries lending to the US every year in order to protect themselves. So that's a huge outflow, which is going from south to north. Again, bigger than the net inflows. And again, it's caused by the problems of unregulated capital. So, next point. Okay, so we've seen, in terms of illicit financial flows, in terms of countries insuring themselves by buying US treasuries and other safe assets, the problems of unregulated or underregulated capital flows, I would argue, cause possibly bigger problems than any of the inflows and outflows that we normally talk about in terms of aid or FDI, etc. But this is putting those figures against what the domestic resources show us. So, it's a little bit small, I'm sorry for people at the back, but what we can see is the net inflows that we just saw in the first slide as a percentage of GDP. So that's the green on the right, a little bit less than 4% of GDP of developing countries. And then the other slides show us in blue government consumption in low-income countries, and then two other things in low-income countries, and then in brown the same figures for middle-income countries. And we can see government consumption between 10 and 15% of GDP, so higher than inflows, but not huge, and lower in lower-income countries. So there's a huge problem there of just generating enough public resources in the poorest countries. GFCF is gross fixed capital formation, which is a reasonable proxy for domestic investment. It includes both public and private investment, which is why I've put here on the right, you can see the private component of that, and you can roughly work out what the government or the state investment is as part of the rest of it. You can see it's bigger, obviously, than inflows, bigger than government consumption, much higher as a percentage of GDP in middle-income countries. Low-income countries suffer from underinvestment. And you can also see the difference between the private figure and the total figure is significantly different between low and middle-income countries. So low-income countries finding it very difficult to do public investment is what that is showing. So again, it's a problem of lack of public resources, particularly in the poorest countries. Next slide. So these are my important conclusions, and the panel can tell me if I'm right or wrong. First, obviously, domestic resource mobilization is absolutely critical, should be the first thing we think about when we talk about finance and development. Getting that domestic investment climate right, particularly how to get the savings reinvested in the local economy through the financial sector, very important. And for us, as Europeans, we know that institutions like the World Bank and the IMF have a very strong influence on those kind of policy decisions in developing countries. And we have a very strong influence over the World Bank and the IMF, so we bear some responsibility for why that hasn't always worked as it should have done. Second is the quality of the inflows is very important. So we shouldn't get obsessed by the quantity. And we certainly shouldn't buy into this argument that all we need to do is use our ODA, for example, to leverage more foreign investment and everything will be right. What matters is what is the quality of the expenditure. And private finance, private inflows, external private finance, both FDI and portfolio inflows have significant problems. They're both very pro-cyclical. So you saw in the crisis they dipped significantly. So just when countries are suffering, they tend to go down. And portfolio flows are highly volatile. They go up and down and become positive and negative depending on the situation globally and the situation in the country. So, important message, quality is important and private flows have significant drawbacks in terms of managing your domestic economy. Third, all of this to me points to the need for systemic reform. It's not about just improving slightly foreign investment or ODA, or it's about cracking down on the things that cause these problems in the first place. So cracking down on tax dodging, both through multinationals, transparency and regulation, and also through cracking down on tax havens. It's about finding better ways to resolve crises through debt workout mechanisms. So these flows often lead in the end to some kind of debt crisis, government debt crisis. There's no systematic way of dealing with that. They tend to go on for too long and harm too many people. It also shows that the institutions we've got don't really work for the time we're operating in, and you've seen that developing countries are insuring themselves by building reserves because they don't trust that the IMF would do one of the main jobs the IMF was supposed to do, which was to be the lender of last resort. And they don't trust it partly because of its scale, but mostly because of the conditions that come attached to IMF lending. And then finally, I think there are bigger questions about the whole monetary system. For example, a proposal made by Undesa and others, why don't we use this thing called special drawing rights, which is a form of reserve asset which all governments have access to and which was increased in 2009 by $250 billion because of the crisis at the stroke of a pen, global quantitative easing. Why don't we use that more regularly to build up the assets of developing countries, to give them the protection they need so they don't need to waste valuable resources that they have to protect themselves. So those are the kind of things that I think we should be talking about in terms of really systemic reform changes. And then finally, we shouldn't forget that there is a huge public financing gap, as you can see, particularly for the poorest countries. And we can't just pretend that it doesn't exist or that it can be filled by private finance. So 82% of the extreme poor live in countries where government spending is less than $1,000 per person per year, less than $3 a day, which is simply not enough to provide sanitation, water, healthcare, education, the things that only public spending really can provide for everybody. This is another important figure, which again comes courtesy of development initiatives, which I hadn't realised, but also I think puts the scale of this in perspective, which is that 5.2 billion people live on less than $10 a day purchasing power parity. So that is by far the majority of the world's population living on less than $10 a day. It's purchasing power parity. That means it's what $10 would buy you in the United States. And in the United States, I believe the poverty line is $11. So almost all of the world's population are living under the poverty line, the equivalent of being under the poverty line in the States. So this is the scale of this problem also requires massive, significant change. And I also always mention the Oxfam figure that 85 individuals own as much wealth as 3 billion of the world's poorest. So there's a huge inequality challenge here, which again I think points to the need for systemic reform.